Hello, Mark here. Before we begin today's episode, I would just like to quickly take the time to ask all of those who are enjoying the series a favour. If the platform you use to listen to Casting Through Ancient Greece has a rating or review system, I would be extremely grateful if you would consider leaving the series a quick review. These ratings and reviews go a long way into helping others discover the show, in turn helping it grow. So if you enjoy the series and can spare a few minutes, I would love to read what you have to say about your experiences with the show. Thanks everyone for your support, and let's get to today's episode. If one has a free choice and can live undisturbed, it is sheer folly to go to war. But suppose the choice was forced upon one: submission to immediate slavery or danger with the hope of survival. Then I prefer the man who stands up to danger, rather than the one who runs away from it. Thucydides on Pericles addressing the Athenians. Hello, I'm Mark Selleck and welcome back to Casting Through Ancient Greece, episode 77, Athens Carries On. Last episode, we looked at quite a lot that was taking place during the second year of the Peloponnesian War. The Peloponnesians, under the command of Archidamus, had once again invaded Attica, with Archidamus carrying out his duties with much more fervour this time around. We saw that he would lead the army into southern Attica, where the silver mines of Laurium were located. The Peloponnesians would ravage the lands from coast to coast, though Athens would still remain behind their walls. In this early stage of the campaign, a new sickness would start to be detected amongst the Athenian population behind their defensive walls. This would turn out to be the beginnings of the plague that would over the summer continue to spread and cause the Athenians much torment. However, at the stage of the Peloponnesians just entering into Attica, and early reports of the plague beginning to be known about, Athens too would begin operations for the second year. Once again, they would employ their fleet and direct it at the Peloponnese, with ships also being committed by Lesbos and Chios. This time around, a larger force would be sent, and would make for the coast of the Argolid, where the army would ravage the lands around Epidaurus and then attempt to capture the city. There would be debate in our times over the intention of this operation. Was Pericles looking to establish a base on the Argolis for future operations and to support Argos? Or, what most scholars now seem to think the case, was Pericles continuing the campaign of the previous year, disrupting the lands of as many Peloponnesian allies as possible, with the capturing of cities more of an attempt at plundering them, rather than looking to hold them. Even though the Athenian force was much larger this second year, their operations would be much more contained. There may well have been grander aims with this year's operation, but a combination of slow progress on the Argolis, they were focusing on much more powerful cities this time, plus the situation in Athens with the plague was now getting out of hand. Pericles was leading the Athenian force and now saw that it was imperative for him to return politically. Once the Athenian fleet returned, the Peloponnesians had departed for back home after their 40 days of campaigning, while the plague had now spread to all areas within the Athenian walls. Well into the summer, the conditions in Athens had become unimaginable, with death lurking around every corner. No matter what remedies were tried, the suffering continued, with those who tended the sick, more often than not, then becoming the plague's next victim. This, coupled with the knowledge that one's status in society or level of devotion to the divine would have no bearing on contracting the disease, would see Athens' social fabric begin to tear. Morals and decency would fade away as those yet to become infected looked to avoid the plague at all costs, or they would engage in every pleasure that they could before, as they saw it, inevitably succumb to the pathogen in turn. This is where we left events in Athens in our last episode, but we had not yet covered all the events of the second year of the war. This episode, we will head back to Athens during the height of the plague, though we'll be heading north to the Chalcidice to Potidaea, as Athens would send further forces to the siege there. This will also give us the opportunity to look back in on the diplomatic situation in Thrace and Macedon. After this, we will then head back to Athens as the year was coming to a close, where Pericles would find himself in a very precarious position, with all the suffering that Athens was enduring. Then, to close things out, we will look at what was happening as the campaigning season was coming to a close. So we will be shifting some focus back to the city of Potidaea, up on the Chalcidice, where we had seen this city had been at the centre of tensions between Athens and Corinth, as the road to war was being paved. Athens had been wary of Corinthian influence in the city, and what this meant for the Athenian interests in the Chalcidice. Athens would send demands to Potidaea, who was an ally of theirs, but also with Corinthian ties. They would seek the city to tear down its defensive walls, expel the Corinthians from within the city, and send hostages to Athens. However, Corinth would end up convincing the city to revolt before any measures were acted upon. We then saw that Corinth would unofficially aid Potidaea in their resistance from Athens, so as to avoid officially breaking the terms of the 30 Years' Peace. In 432 BC, the Battle of Potidaea would break out. Athens, along with aid from their allies, this also including a force of Macedonian cavalry, would oppose the Potidaean rebels, who had in support other cities from the Chalcidice and the Corinthian volunteer force. However, the rebels would be defeated outside the walls of Potidaea, though were able to retreat back within and set up a defence of the city. This would then see the Battle of Potidaea transition into the Siege of Potidaea. Athens would need to commit even more forces to this growing situation if they were to set up an effective blockade of the city. This was effectively the situation we left Potidaea in last time we looked at events here, before we then moved on to the unfolding developments of the outbreak of the Peloponnesian War. During the second year of the war, Potidaea would come back into focus, with Pericles sending a new injection of forces into the siege. We would hear that after the operation Pericles led on the Peloponnese had returned to Athens, he would arrange for some of his closest colleagues to take over command of the returning forces and then send them en route to Potidaea. It appears that with the proceedings not going to plan on the Peloponnese, Pericles was looking for another avenue to help soothe public opinion. If he could bring a resolution to the situation in Potidaea, this would give the Athenians a great success for their second year, while also freeing up thousands of Athenian hoplites. This quick turnaround would also see that a good proportion of Athens' fighting men could be sent out of Athens with minimal exposure to the plague. This renewed effort would see that there would now be almost 10,000 Athenian hoplites, if we can assume none had returned to Athens since the siege began. Nearly half the Athenian force was newly arrived and somewhat fresh from the frustrations of siege warfare. However, Thucydides would tell us, when they arrived there, they brought up siege engines against Potidaea and did everything they could do to capture it. Nothing, however, went right. They neither captured the city nor accomplished anything else that might have been expected from such a force. Thucydides would tell us that a large reason for the Athenians' failure was due to the plague now spreading through the army. Even though the reinforcements had left Potidaea not long after returning to the Peloponnese, they appear to still have contracted some cases and brought the plague with them to Potidaea. This would then see infections start spreading to the troops that had been holding the siege since 432 BC. After some 40 days, this force of 4,000 hoplites had lost a quarter of its strength, and now re-embarked their ships to sail back for Athens. However, the siege on Potidaea would continue, with the rest of the Athenians remaining to continue these tedious operations. This effort to end the struggle around Potidaea had now also failed, this leading some to question if it had in fact been ordered by Pericles. The thought here was that Pericles' enemies were now gaining more influence and public opinion would start shifting against Pericles during the campaigning season. This we will explore in the second half of the episode, though it does appear that Pericles was still in a position of authority when returning from the Peloponnese. One of the biggest indicators of this was the fact that Hagnon, one of Pericles' closest associates, was in command of the forces that went to Potidaea. It seems extremely unlikely that Pericles' enemies would have put a man so closely tied to Pericles and his policy in charge, if they had control over proceedings. Another big part to those seeing Pericles not being involved in the Potidaean operation was they saw this as a reckless move, and out of character for Pericles. Though as we have pointed out, Pericles was in a tough spot. He knew that opposition was building against him. He had seen from his experiences of the first year that providing the Athenians with some successes would help keep public opinion on his side. Now though, well and truly into the summer, he was running out of time to deliver. The Peloponnesian campaign had been cut short, probably due to the worsening situation in Athens due to the plague. However, launching a raid from within Attica was not an option, as the plague had rendered forming any sort of army supported from within Athens' walls as useless. The only option open was to utilise the force that had not been in Athens during the spread of the plague. The best option was then seen to attempt to force a result at Potidaea, as the Athenian forces there were also devoid of the disease. Perhaps in a situation where the plague was not a factor, this would have been an extremely questionable move, but given the circumstances, it was the only avenue open to Pericles if he was going to attempt to rescue his political position. As events were unfolding around Potidaea, we had seen that there had been a somewhat confusing diplomatic situation up in the north. Originally, Athens had a friendly relationship with Perdiccas of Macedon, who had come to power after the death of his father, Alexander I, in the 450s. This had seen a turbulent time in Macedon, with regions revolting from Macedonian control, and two of Perdiccas' brothers ruling regions in their own right. However, this alliance with Athens would end around 433, with Athens supporting Perdiccas' brother, Philip. Perdiccas now looked to try and stir up trouble for Athens elsewhere, as Athens had sent forces to support Philip's bid on the Macedonian throne. Supposedly, he had messages sent to Sparta and Corinth. In Sparta, the talks were attempting to see a conflict involving Athens develop in the south, while they attempted to convince the Corinthians to incite a revolt in Potidaea. Perdiccas was also able to make allies of the different regions in and around the Chalcidice, which would strengthen his position militarily. Revolt did break out in Potidaea, but Athens would continue with its support of Philip, with the forces sent eventually besieging Perdiccas at Pydna instead of focusing on Potidaea. However, with Corinthian forces entering Potidaea and the siege at Pydna reaching no resolution, the Athenians would come to terms with Perdiccas so that they could turn their attention to Potidaea. This now saw Athens technically in an alliance with both Perdiccas and Philip, though this would be short-lived. Perdiccas would end up accepting a post as commander of the cavalry for the defence of Potidaea. The Battle of Potidaea would then develop, though Perdiccas' forces would be held at bay while the main battle was fought. This, as we said earlier, was an Athenian victory, though it would lead to the siege of Potidaea, with the defeated forces still intact and retreating within the walls. Not long after this, we then had the breakout of the Peloponnesian War. However, the diplomatic situation up north would shift once again, with Athens having entered into an alliance with the Odrysian king Chalcidice, who ruled over the most powerful Thracian kingdom. Then in turn, an alliance would be arranged between Perdiccas and Athens, where Athens would give Thermae back to Perdiccas and drop their support of Philip. For their part, Chalcidice and Perdiccas would now support Athens' efforts in putting an end to the revolt in Potidaea and the Chalcidices. However, as we saw, the stalemate around Potidaea would continue through the summer of 430, and we wouldn't see a resolution until the winter, which we will be covering next episode. Now, these were not the only diplomatic manoeuvres taking place. As we would find, Sparta looking to try and upset the situation in the north, as well as attempting to enlist aid from further afield. Sparta would send a diplomatic mission towards the end of the summer, with the intent of recruiting additional help in the war with Athens. This mission would be made up of representatives from a number of Peloponnesian cities, with Aristeus of Corinth being one, remembering here he had been instrumental in the Corinthian support of Potidaea. The mission would first travel north into Thracian lands, where talks would be entered into with Chalcidice. Sparta would attempt to try and have him abandon his alliance with Athens, and instead send an army to relieve the siege of Potidaea. As well as this, they sought help in continuing their journey across the Hellespont and into the Persian Empire, where they would complete their other half of their mission. In Persia, the aim was to try and secure money and convince Artaxerxes to join in the war on Sparta's side. However, while the delegation was meeting with Chalcidice, some Athenian ambassadors had also been present. Chalcidice had recently been made an Athenian citizen, probably Athens' attempt at keeping him as a secure ally. So the ambassadors would use this to persuade him to hand over the Peloponnesian delegation to them. Chalcidice would agree to their proposal and would have the Peloponnesians arrested after having marched through Thrace and arriving at the ship that they would take across the Hellespont. The prisoners were then handed to the Athenians, who brought them back to Athens. Thucydides would then tell us, the Athenians, fearing that Aristeus, who even before then appeared to have the chief hand in all their troubles in Potidaea and in Thrace, might do them more harm still if he escaped. On the same day, without giving them a trial, or allowing them to say what they wished to say in their defence, put them all to death and threw their bodies into a pit. They regarded this action as legitimate retaliation for the way in which the Spartans had been behaving, since they also killed and thrown into pits all the Athenian and allied traders who they had caught sailing in merchant ships around the Peloponnese. So this is where we'll leave the events around Potidaea for now, though we'll be heading back here next episode, when we will see a resolution come about during the winter of 430-429. Hopefully you have been able to follow along with what has been developing over this second year so far. I must admit it can be tricky following the different threads that were occurring, but hopefully as we complete this year and tie off the loose ends next episode, it will all come together. But now I would like to turn our attention back to Athens and the political situation there, as this second year was not going the way Pericles had hoped, and those morale-boosting victories he was hoping for were not forthcoming. A number of factors were now conspiring in how public opinion was developing against Pericles. We had seen from the outset the policy of staying behind Athens' walls while the Peloponnesians ravaged their lands was one that many had found hard to swallow, especially the hoplite class. However, a number of factors helped keep these feelings in check. Pericles had seen to it that while Attica had enemy forces within their lands, no assemblies would be held. He had made an effort that what was taking place out in the regions of Attica was not being openly discussed in public circles. While Pericles would also see to it that limited military operations would be conducted to show that Athens was hitting back and achieving their own successes against the enemy. This had helped see public opinion remain with Pericles, while his inspirational funeral oration at the end of the year probably sealed the deal. However, the second year was now unfolding as the first had. It began similar enough with the Peloponnesian invasion, though from here the situation changed within Athens, along with their patience for Pericles' policy. Not long after the Peloponnesians entered Attica, signs of the plague began to appear within Athens, and before long the torment and suffering behind Athens' walls had reached a level not experienced before. Pericles had led a naval operation to the Peloponnese with much the same aims as the previous year. However, this time around, the force, even though larger, had very little success. They had managed to ravage some Peloponnesian territory on the Argolis and plunder a port on the coast of Laconia, but their efforts were far from what had been achieved the previous year. It would also seem that Pericles was forced to call an end to the campaign early, due to his political position back in Athens becoming far more fragile, due to the increasing strain of the developing plague. Pericles would then arrange for the force he had led to be sent off again, but this time north to Potidaea. We have already pointed out that this may have been another attempt to gain military success for the year. These forces had been absent from Athens and had very limited contact with the plague, so were the only viable troops to be sent on campaign. However, Pericles would remain behind due to the political troubles at home, and would send one of his closest political allies to lead the fleet. Though it appears that it may have been at this point where Athens would now begin to turn on Pericles. The chronology of events around what was taking place in relation to the attacks on Pericles are hard to tell for certain, as Thucydides is quite vague. However, Donald Kagan suggests it appears that an assembly may have taken place that would see the launching of the fleet to Potidaea. Remembering by this stage the Peloponnesians had left Attica, therefore an assembly could now be held. It seems Pericles still held control, as he was able to see Hagnon, one of his closest associates, in command. However, it also seems that Pericles' opponents were able to pass a motion that an embassy be sent to Sparta, this also while Pericles still held command. It appears with the departure of the forces and Pericles' associates, he may have been in a weaker position at home, and the attacks on him were becoming more successful. So, with the Spartans having completed their second invasion of Attica, and an Athenian expedition sent to aid Potidaea, Pericles had now recognised the growing tensions towards his policies, of not going out to meet the Peloponnesians. Thucydides says that at this point, there was now a change in the spirit of the Athenians. Their land had been devastated twice, while they remained behind their walls, while the stresses of war and now the added pressures of the plague had seen the Athenians' resolve sink to an all-time low. Having seen all this, Pericles would arrange to have an assembly held, where he could address the citizens, with the aim, as Thucydides puts it, of putting fresh courage into them and of guiding their embittered spirits so as to leave them in a calmer and more confident frame of mind. Hi there, are you after more Casting Through Ancient Greece episodes and would like to support the show? Well, I have some good news for you. Over on Patreon, a new bonus episode is released every month, where we look in more detail over topics that we have covered in the series so far. In this bonus series, we travel back to the earliest times of Greek history, where we then move forward, picking out interesting themes and topics to delve deeper into. This is also an opportunity for supporters to help drive what we cover in these bonus episodes. We have just wrapped up a series of episodes looking at different elements around the Ionian Revolt. Now we are heading into the phase of the Greek and Persian War, where we'll have many new angles to view this conflict from. So, if you have been enjoying the series, would like to support the show and gain access to ad-free, early access episodes, plus bonus episodes, please consider heading over to the Casting Through Ancient Greece Patreon page and supporting the show. Let's now get back to the episode. Before we turn to the assembly and the speech Pericles would deliver there, I want to first focus on the delegation that Athens would send to Sparta. Thucydides is very brief around this point, but it becomes clear through Pericles' speech the aim of the delegation was to arrange a peace. This delegation was sent out before Pericles held the assembly he proposed, and while he still held his political position. Thucydides does say at this point the Athenians began to blame Pericles for having persuaded them to go to war and to hold him responsible for all their misfortunes which had overtaken them. It was in this context that the mission was sent off to Sparta, this also highlighting that Athens was still operating in a democratic fashion. Sometimes it can be hard to move away from the idea that Pericles held power over all that took place in Athens. Though, with public opinion now moving drastically against him, actions that went against his policy could still be taken. As I have said, Thucydides is very brief around this Athenian delegation, and we get no information from him on what the Athenians asked the Spartans, and how the Spartans responded to this delegation. This meeting of our two main belligerents, for the first time since war broke out, seems like it should be quite a big deal in understanding why the war would continue on. So it does seem strange Thucydides would omit this from his history. However, we're going to turn to Donald Kagan, who attempts to try and understand what might have been going on here. Kagan suggests that the Athenians probably would have not offered peace terms, but as the side who was in the weaker position probably sought out the conditions of peace that Sparta found acceptable. Kagan suspects that even though the Greeks could be harsh victors, such as forcing cities to be abandoned, or even killing the men and enslaving the women and children, this probably wouldn't have been part of the Spartans' terms. His reasoning here is that with the benefit of hindsight, we can see Sparta would not even resort to these sorts of terms after 27 years of war, when all their enemies were completely helpless. Perhaps then we can look to the terms that would be extended to Athens in 404 BC, and see if these were a reasonable demand to make in 430. Peace would be made in 404 on the conditions that Athens destroy their long walls and the Piraeus, hand over their ships except for 12, receive back their exiles, have the same friends and enemies as the Spartans, and follow them wherever they should lead, by land and by sea. In effect, this would make Athens a satellite of Sparta, much like many of Sparta's Peloponnesian League members. However, given that Athens was still essentially secure, their fleet intact, their treasury full, and their lines of income still secure, these terms would have been unacceptable, and one would think Sparta would know that too. If they too wanted peace and an end to the war, their terms would need to not cripple Athens so drastically. Kagan suspects that more immediate events and situations around the opening of the war were the target of Spartan demands. This perhaps all demands that Athens remove the Macarian decree, withdraw from Potidaea, and restore Aegina's autonomy. These perhaps would be favourable to the Athenians if they were in a desperate enough situation to see the war ended. Though Kagan also floats the idea that Sparta, given their favourable position, may have tried to gain more from the situation, by seeking the Athenians to dismantle the Athenian Empire. As we know, Sparta had been concerned with Athens' growing influence, which was due to the growth of their empire. Though this would appear to be one demand too many, as it would see Athens reduced to a minor power. It is here then that we could reasonably assume that nothing amounted from the delegation's mission, and as Thucydides says, failed to achieve anything. Kagan then points out that this episode around Athenians' peace party seeking terms only served to highlight that Pericles was right in that Athens could not achieve any satisfactory peace until they could convince Sparta that they would not surrender and could not be defeated. If Sparta were convinced of this, then they might perhaps offer more favourable terms that would be accepted. Though, for the time being, all the Athenian peace party had achieved was convince Sparta that Athens was weakening and would surrender if the pressure was kept up, rather than showing them that their strategy was useless in the face of Pericles' defensive policy. So the war would continue with this view in mind. Essentially, the last 2 years of Athenian suffering to convince the Spartans that their offensive power was pointless against Athens' defences was undone with his attempted peace talks. So, with Athenian opinion at its lowest when it came to Pericles and his policies, he would now call an assembly to attempt to gain favour back to his line of thinking. This would see Pericles deliver a speech with the intention of instilling a calmer and more confident frame of mind into the people. We had seen that Pericles had been under attack from those within Athens that wanted more action taken against the Peloponnesians' incursions into Attica. Now, though, an anti-war element of Athens society had become more vocal, looking to make Pericles a scapegoat for their misfortunes. However, as Pericles would point out in his speech, he had not promised any easy victory, but had warned of what it would take to win a war against the Peloponnesians. This was pointing to the idea that the people had voted on his policy, knowing what was to come, and having chosen to accept this path, they too had some responsibility in the situation. Thucydides would have Pericles begin his address as follows. I expected this outbreak of anger on your part against me, since I understand the reason for it, and I have called an assembly with the object in view, to remind you of your previous resolutions and to put forward my own case against you, if we find that there is anything unreasonable in your anger against me and in your giving way to your misfortunes. My own opinion is that when the whole state is on the right course, it is a better thing for each separate individual than when private interests are satisfied, but the state as a whole is going downhill. However well off a man may be in his private life, he will still be involved in the general ruin if his country is destroyed. Whereas, so long as the state itself is secure, individuals have a much greater chance of recovering from their private misfortunes. Therefore, since the state can support individuals in their suffering, but no one person by himself can bear the load that rests upon the state, is it not right for all of us to rally to her defence? Is it not wrong to act as you are doing now? For you have been so dismayed by disaster in your homes that you are losing your grip on the common safety. You are attacking me for having spoken in favour of war and yourselves for having voted for it. Throughout the speech, Pericles would also point out his virtues that were also aligned with the virtues of Athens and being a good citizen, these drawing from a similar thread found with his funeral oration, where it appears he was attempting to remind the people of these points. However, with all the resentment coming his way, he would also have a tone of bitterness against his fellow citizens' ingratitude, where later in his speech he would say, I am the same as I was, and do not alter. It is you who have changed. What has happened is this. You took my advice when you were still untouched by misfortune, and repented your own actions when things went badly with you. It is because your own resolution is weak that my policy appears to you to be mistaken. It is a policy that which entails suffering, but its ultimate benefits are still far away and not yet clear for all of us to see. Although there would be points raised that would address those who had also argued for more action during the Peloponnesians' invasions of Attica, a great deal of the effort had been directed at instilling a greater resolve in those with a defeatist attitude. It's in this speech that Pericles would make it clear that Athens had gone seeking Spartan terms earlier, and he would end his address to the assembly with, "It is for you to safeguard that future glory, and to do nothing now that is dishonourable. Now, therefore, is the time to show your energy, and to achieve both these objectives. Do not send embassies to Sparta, do not give the impression that you are bowed down under your present sufferings. To face calamity with a mind as unclouded as may be, and quickly to react against it, that, in a city and in an individual, is real strength." So, with this speech, Pericles had attempted to cool some of the anger that had grown against him. He had used arguments to show that the anger was unwarranted against him alone. Athens was a democracy, and the people had seen him to be a leader they wished to put their support behind. In this way, they had also made a choice, one that Pericles had made clear would not be an easy path forward. So those supporting this policy also had to bear the responsibility for the misfortunes that would occur. Pericles had also highlighted that suffering on the individual level would not see Athens defeated, if all its citizens came together to serve the city. On the other hand, if people looked to their own personal situations and made this their priority, then even if they did manage to live a fortunate life, it would inevitably end in disaster for them, as Athens, with no unity, would become weak and collapse, and with it, all those fortunate individuals. Pericles, on a number of occasions now, had made it clear to all that their ultimate fortune was tied to Athens' prosperity and success. Pericles would now be successful in convincing the Athenians to not send any more embassies to Sparta, and seems to have instilled some vigour back into the Athenians. However, his political enemies remained, and would continue to attack him. Seeing that his policy remained popular with the majority, his opponents now looked to attack him through the law courts, this being a common tactic. The charges Pericles would have to answer for were for that of corruption, a charge levelled at just about every influential Athenian political figure. Pericles would have to present his accounting while in office to the courts, where it would have been difficult to make public every expenditure. In the end, a great deal of resentment against Pericles still existed, and he would be found to have some level of guilt, with him having to pay a fine. Various sources put it somewhere between 15 to 50 talents, while Diodorus puts it at a staggering 80 talents. However, most historians stick to the lower end of 15 talents to be more realistic, with this even a huge amount for an individual. However, this fine also seemed to carry with it the removal from office, this seeing Pericles now absent from public life, though this would be short-lived, as when it came time again to vote for the positions of generals, Pericles would find himself back, influencing and administering Athenian political affairs. By this stage, at the end of the summer, it would appear those in Athens who favoured war, often called the war party, were now influencing Athenian policy. It's important here to note that, like with what we have described with the Spartan war and peace parties, these were not political parties like how we today think of a party. These terms are mainly used for a simple way for us to understand what was happening politically and where the main efforts were coming from. In reality, shifting groups would come together, often due to particular issues, and would centre around an individual or a small group of influential figures. There would also be no real party discipline, as when other issues would present themselves, this could see those aligned groups now at odds with each other. Donald Kagan points out three main opinions that seem to be present in Athens at this early stage of the war, that can perhaps give us some clear distinctions between these three parties. He would write, 1. The desire for immediate peace with Sparta. Its advocates we call the Peace Party. 2. The determination to wage an aggressive war against Sparta, to run risks to try and defeat Sparta, rather than wear her out. This we call the War Party. 3. The willingness to support the policy of Pericles, avoiding risks, wearing down the Spartans, and working for a negotiated peace on the basis of the status quo, meaning the situation before the breakout of war. These men we call the moderates. Anyway, with Pericles' moderate policy now in disfavour, the peace party's attempt at negotiating with Sparta a failure, the war party held the reins. A good indication that this was the case was with the Spartan envoys that had been taken prisoner, that we spoke about earlier. As we saw, they were executed, an action that would only inflame tensions between the two cities, not an action in line with the peace party's aims or that of Pericles' policies. This group also looked to act more aggressively towards actions that were taking place away from Attica. Last episode, we saw Sparta had conducted operations at Zakynthos, near the opening of the Corinthian Gulf. Another operation saw the Ambracians attack the city of Amphiplytonian Argos, this being in the region of the Ambracian Gulf. These activities were taking place on the west coast of the mainland, just north of the Corinthian Gulf opening. As we have seen, this area had seen competing interests at play as the situation around Epidamnus and Corcyra was unfolding before the breakout of the Peloponnesian War. The Athenian general Phormio, with a fleet of 30 ships, would be sent to reconquer this Argos of the Ambracian Gulf, and would after its capture enter an alliance with the Acarnanians in the lands just south. This would appear to be one of the last actions of the summer of 430, and it appears Phormio had returned to Athens after this was complete. However, as winter was coming on, it looks as though Athens was seeking to secure their position in the Corinthian Gulf and near the southern Anatolian coast. An Athenian fleet of 20 ships was sent to Neopactus under the command of Phormio. The intention here was to safeguard this Athenian port midway along the Corinthian Gulf from sudden attack. This plan would seem like an action that would have seen support under Pericles. However, there would be more to the fleet's deployment. Thucydides would write that Phormio was tasked with instituting a blockade to prevent anyone entering or leaving Corinth and the Gulf. This being a far more aggressive move than simply protecting their port at Neopactus. They were now effectively waging war on Peloponnesian commerce. In addition to this, 6 more ships had been sent under the command of Melissander to Caria and Lycia to collect tribute from these regions of Anatolia. Perhaps an assessment of the treasury had shown that a timely collection of funds from these far-flung regions was needed, given that the tribute had not been gathered from this year from Potidaea or Aegina. In addition to this, the fleet was also tasked with anti-pirate activities, preventing Peloponnesian privateers from establishing a base in the region and disrupting merchant shipping. However, Melissander's mission would not go to plan, as after reaching the Anatolian coast, he and his men would march inland towards Lycia, but on their way would be forced into having to fight a battle where Melissander and a number of his men would be killed. However, this small setback would soon be redeemed in the eyes of the Athenians, with developments that would take place around Potidaea, for which we'll be beginning our next episode with. So, I think this is a good place to wrap up the episode. We have pretty much dealt with most of the events of the campaigning season of 430 BC, over this and the previous episode. This episode we travelled back to Potidaea to look at the ongoing siege, while also giving us an opportunity to lay out the diplomatic situation up there. As we saw, the Athenian efforts with the arrival of the additional 4,000 troops did not bring an end to the siege, though its conclusion won't be too far off, and we will be dealing with it with the opening of our next episode. We'd also focused in on some activities Sparta was engaging in far from Attica. This saw us, the previous episode, look to their attempt on the island of Zakynthos, while this episode we look closer at the diplomatic mission they engaged in. However, these did not turn out in their favour, and their embassy was killed before it could make it to the Persian Empire. With all the pressures of war and the plague taking its toll on the Athenians, they would also now start to be influenced by other factions emerging in Athens. Pericles, although able to appeal to the Athenians, would be politically sidelined for a short period. This would see 2 other political factions attempt to influence policy. The peace party would engage in talks with Sparta in an attempt to bring war to an end, but it would appear the terms were too harsh to be popular in Athens. This would effectively see the peace party discredited and allow the war party, who wanted a more aggressive approach to the war, to be followed, now influencing policy. We would see this begin to emerge as the summer of 430 came to an end, with the fleet sent to the Corinthian Gulf and southern Anatolia. Next episode, we will be looking at events as winter would turn into summer and the 3rd year of the war would take place. Here we'll be looking at the conclusion of the siege of Potidaea, while we'll also be turning to the campaign the Spartans would lead out of the Peloponnese once again. However, this time around, they would have a different target and would march into Boeotian lands, with Plataea in their sights. This operation will probably form the majority of our episode. We will then turn to the death of Pericles. He would only live to see the first 2.5 years of the war, and the plague would also carry him off. With his death would also see what many view as his moderate policy, now open to re-evaluation. Though evidence of his influence and respect in Athens would see to it that his policy would survive to an extent for some years after his death. However, after this, we would enter into a new phase of the Peloponnesian War, with new influential figures at the helm. Thank you everyone for your continued support, and a big shout out to all those who have found some value in the series and have been supporting it on Patreon and other various ways. Your contribution is truly helping me grow the series. I would like to give a special shout out to 2 new supporters over on Patreon. A big shout out to Paul Ferminga Machu and Tyler Harris for deciding to sign up and support the series. I truly appreciate it. If you have also found some value in the show and wish to support the series, you can head to www.castingthroughancientgreece.com and click on the Support the Series button, where you can discover many ways to extend your support to helping the series grow. Be sure to stay connected and updated on what's happening in the series, and join me over on Facebook or Instagram at Casting Through Ancient Greece, or on Twitter at Casting Greece. And be sure to subscribe to the series over at the Casting Through Ancient Greece website. I hope you can join me next time when we continue the narrative in the series with episode 78, Potidaea, Plataea and Tragedy.